Morning. I don't speak German, so I have no idea what Sebastian just said about me. I hope it was good. It's truly an honor to be here. I want to thank the conference organizers for inviting me. This is my first time in Germany, or as I've been told, actually maybe Bavaria. It's quite lovely. I like it very much. I had a chance to sightsee a bit in Munich yesterday. It's a really great city, really great food, and of course, really good beer. We're living in a time of tremendous change in IT, which is being driven by even more profound change in the nature of business. And what I want to talk about today is what that business change is and what we need to do in IT to respond to it. And to start, we need to go back to 1973 in a book called The Coming of Post-Industrial Society, written by Daniel Bell, where he posited a transition from industrialism of the last 200 years to something new, which would be characterized, first of all, by work that was based on knowledge and creativity rather than bureaucracy or manual labor. That the primary driver of economic activity would be services as opposed to products. That the focus and really the purpose of businesses would be change and innovation. And the enabler for that change and innovation would be the pervasive integration of computers into business. Now, if that sounds vaguely familiar, it should, because we're just now at the point where that's all coming to fruition. We're actually right now at the point in history where we're really fully making the transition from an industrial to a post-industrial society. And that transition brings along with it some deep fundamental shifts in the nature of businesses and companies and work. First of all, going from products to services. When you think of yourself as being in the product business, you think that you're in the business of making things and filling those things up with value through some kind of value stream, and then giving that value to a customer in exchange for money. And sales is a transactional thing. You know, once you've gotten somebody to buy your brand of soap because it has a more brightly colored package, you're done. And marketing is about broadcast and convincing people that if you buy my brand of soap, because it has a more brightly colored box, your family will be happier. With a service model, on the other hand, what you're creating are experiences that unfold over time. And the value from them doesn't come until someone actually uses them. So you have to, in a sense, work with the customer in order for anyone to get any value. So for example, if I own an airline and I have some airplanes and I sell you a ticket, it doesn't really mean anything until you actually take the trip and you have a good experience or a bad experience. And sales shifts to being an ongoing relationship. So I'm a United customer, or maybe I'm not a United customer. And marketing becomes as much about listening and understanding as it is about talking. So what do I need to do to keep you as my customer? More legroom, in-flight Wi-Fi, power in the seats, so on and so forth. Now, it used to be that it was fairly straightforward to understand where we were in our lives at any given point in time. Whether we were at work or at home, whether we were socializing or alone, whether we were in the physical realm or the online realm. And those areas are really starting to blend in our lives. So if you go to the coffee shop, are you going there to chat with your friends or are you going there to work? Your phone, do you use it to call your mother? Do you use it to upload pictures of cats to the internet? Do you use it to check your work email? When you go to the library, libraries are undergoing tremendous change these days and trying to figure out what they're really about. Do you go there because you want to get a physical book off a physical shelf and sit on a couch and read it? Or do you go to the library because you want to get on the internet? And when you drive your car, is it really a car? Or is it actually a very expensive and complicated online music player? Well, the answer to all these questions, of course, is yes. Now, one of the consequences of this blending or infusion is it makes it harder to know how to navigate and manage and control these aspects of our lives. So if I'm having a problem with my car, do I need to talk to Honda or do I need to talk to Pandora? If I'm a freelancer, and according to statistics, by the year 2020, 40% of the US workforce will be freelance. So do I work for myself, or do I work for my client, or do I work for the broker that got me the gig in the first place? How do you provide customer support? I had a great interaction with Air Canada around the trip to come here. Because of the way my tickets were bought, I couldn't pick my seats on their website. And to be honest, I got a little annoyed and I posted a snarky tweet on Twitter about it. Within 10 minutes, somebody from Air Canada had contacted me on Twitter. We had a DM exchange, and they got me exactly the seats that I wanted. It was a great experience. It made me feel very positive about Air Canada, but it had nothing to do with their normal mechanisms for providing customer support. It all happened out in public in an environment where they had no control. If I'm in business and I use some kind of cloud-based business service, where is my data? Is it managed by the SaaS provider? If they run on top of some kind of platform service, is it there? If they use Heroku and Heroku runs on top of Amazon Web Services, does Amazon have the data? If I read a post somewhere that says Amazon is having an outage in their US East region, do I care or not, and how do I even know whether I care? Now, when we think about complicated versus complex systems, complicated systems generally are a thing that has a lot of parts, and the relationships between those parts are pretty clear and contained. And the important thing to understand about it is that when it comes to thinking about change or failure, we know how to predict and model and control that. A car is a perfect example of a complicated system. Very few of us anymore would know how to fix our cars. But we do understand that we have a flat tire. It's very unlikely that that's going to have any direct impact on the engine. Data centers are good examples of complicated systems. The way we organize our companies with hierarchies and reporting chains and things like that. A complex system, on the other hand, consists of many independent things that have fluid relationships across boundaries with a lot of other things. So a complex system could be anything from a flock of birds to an economy. You can't really structure the economy as a hierarchy and say, well, the president and the Federal Reserve is at the top, and then you have all the big companies, and then the middle-sized companies, and so on and so forth. It's much more complex and shifting than that. An interesting thing is if you think about companies and challenges in managing companies, it often comes down to the difference between how we organize them as complicated systems and what they really are, which is collections of individuals interacting with each other. If you have a car, for example, and you turn the steering wheel to the left, the whole car is going to go to the left. No part of it is going to kind of wander off in a different direction. But if your company brings in a new CEO, and the CEO says, okay, we're changing the culture now, well, the CEO is the boss. How come everybody just doesn't do what they're told? Because they're all individuals and they have politics and fiefdoms and different motivations. And that's more of the environment we're finding ourselves in these days. Complex systems have some very counterintuitive properties that we need to understand. The first is what's known as emergence. So if we take a relatively simple example, if you will, of a complex system, which is a flock of birds, and you study the rules that govern their behavior, those rules all talk about how individual birds interact with their neighbors. There are actually no rules about flocks. And from a certain perspective, there's no such thing as a flock. It's just something that we see that arises from the behavior of the individuals. Complex systems are also subject to failures that cascade. There was a very interesting situation not long ago where NASDAQ went completely offline for almost a day. What happened was they were experiencing unusual volume from incoming automated trading systems, to the point where NASDAQ software basically made a decision, which was programmed into it, that it needed to fail over to some backup systems. And unfortunately, the nature of the traffic exposed a bug in those backup systems which brought the entire environment completely down. And it was actually worse than if the failover had never happened. And this illustrates another characteristic which is known as sensitivity to history. So if that traffic had been a little bit different, if it had started a little later in the day, if it peaked a little lower, if it accelerated a little more slowly, the failover might never have happened, or if it did, the bug might never have been exposed, and everything would have been fine. So you can have very similar situations in complex systems that lead to very different outcomes, which makes them kind of hard to manage and hard to test. Probably the most important characteristic is that complex systems tend to be very sloppy and they have a lot of failures, but they're very resilient. If we think about our flock of birds flying along and there's a big giant windmill in the way, they don't all just fly into it. They fly around it. And from the perspective of the flock or the system is actually broken apart, but then it puts itself back together again. And it may be the case, unfortunately, that a few of the birds actually do fly into the windmill, but the group as a whole continues on. If you think of an airplane trying to do that, trying to split itself into two pieces and fly around a windmill, it will fall to the ground and it will crash. So complex systems are challenging because we can't actually fully model or predict or control them. And in fact, when we try to do that, we often make things worse. We take our resilient flock of birds and we turn it into a brittle airplane, and if it encounters something unexpected like the windmill, failure is catastrophic. And as we saw with the example of NASDAQ, it's possible for individual components to behave exactly the way they're supposed to and cause a system-level failure in the process. So what do? We can't control them, we can't manage them. Do we just sort of throw up our arms and say, oh well, we don't know what to do? Well, there actually are things we can do, but we have to change our strategy quite a bit. We have to shift from trying to create things that are fail-safe to what's known as safe to fail, where we conduct experiments where we know that if it blows up, it's okay, it's not going to bring the whole world down, and we can learn from that. And we can know whether we're going in a direction that seems like it's okay or a direction that seems like it's bad and we need to give up on it. We need to shift from the idea that we can understand and manage systems through their component parts and instead engage in systems thinking, where we think about the whole and the relationships between the parts. We need to move from managing things as hierarchies to networks, more open networks, and shift our focus from tight coupling, where we want to coordinate everything so everything works nicely together and there's minimal waste and maximum understanding, and adopt a much more loosely coupled mode where we have flexibility and individual components can fail and succeed more gracefully. Now, this may all seem a little nice but theoretical. What does it actually have to do with anything real? The fact is that businesses more and more are facing complexity issues every day. If you think about social business or the connected company or the empowered employee, systems like Yammer that are designed to allow information to flow freely across companies and empower employees to make decisions when they need to be made, rather than sticking to established reporting chains and lines of communication. And to make it worse, you start letting your employees directly speak with your customers. When I had my interaction with Air Canada, that wasn't happening in their internal system, so it wasn't controlled per se, but it still worked. If you look at API ecosystems where companies are starting to build platforms and engage vendors, third-party vendors to build around those platforms, from the customer's perspective, what they see is a service that's provided by sort of an aggregate of independent vendors. If we look at our 40% freelancers and you mix in BYOD where they're all bringing their own devices, and you mix into that co-working where people are starting to work away from the office, and you mix into that consumerization of IT where you may have many different cloud-based solutions for IT problems across the company that aren't centrally administered, it's very much of a complex systems problem. Now, to make things a little bit worse, we're not quite done yet with this transition from industrial to post-industrial society. We're living in the age of disruption, where incumbent companies are being disrupted by competitors who come in and completely change the conversation. And this disruption is accelerating. So Kodak was happily in business for 100 years before they were disrupted by smartphones and digital cameras. Microsoft had 30 years, and now people are starting to wonder whether Microsoft is relevant anymore. Apple went from being the most valuable company in the world to being a question mark. Have they lost their edge? Are they being disrupted by Google? Are they being beaten by Samsung? In 12 months. Now, on the other hand, you look at a company like Amazon and Amazon Web Services, which is accelerating away from their competitors so fast that Gartner had to change the scale on their Magic Quadrant diagram in order to put AWS in the same slide as all of their competitors. So what we see in all of this is that businesses are facing a new and different set of imperatives. They have to shift from thinking in terms of scalability and efficiency and stability and how do I make the same Band-Aids I made yesterday but better, faster, cheaper, to how do I make something different every day and how do I make it in a different way. They need to shift from having this static, discontinuous, broadcast kind of relationship with their customers. Hey, here's our new product, here's what it does, you should buy it, thank you very much, to having a conversation, and a conversation that they don't control, and having the ability to hear messages that they don't control. And finally, if you look at the way that companies are starting to think about and organize themselves in order to meet those challenges, they're starting to do it more as complex systems than complicated ones. Now, when we try to find a conceptual model of, well, how would you actually do that? How would you be an adaptable company in a complex world? Interestingly, we can go all the way back to the dawn of computing and the work that people like Norbert Wiener did in the 1940s in developing cybernetics, or the science of feedback. What he observed during World War II, he was working with the military, particularly on automating targeting of guns. He was also working with other scientists in areas of physiology and biology. And what he observed is that in many realms, what you don't do is make a plan and then carry it out. You know, if you're building a road, you really need to plan it all out first, because if you lay down your road and it's not quite in the right place, you can't really move it. But in a lot of cases, that's exactly what you do, is you have a hypothesis of how you're going to get from A to B, and you make a first step, and then you get feedback from the external world. And the whole idea of feedback actually came from cybernetics. You get information back that says, how well did you do? And you adjust based on that, and you go through a process of successive approximation of getting to where you want to go. If you're targeting a gun, for example, depending on how hot it is, what the humidity is, and how old the grease is in your ball bearings, when you try and point it in a particular direction, you may miss by a little bit. You may be a little short, you may be a little long, and so you need feedback that tells you where you were relative to where you thought you were going, and then you adjust based on that. In addition, you're aiming based on some idea of where the plane is going, and if the plane changes its evasive strategy, your own strategy of shooting it down doesn't work anymore, so you have to adjust that. If you look at a lot of the techniques that companies are adopting to do adaptive business, things like lean startup, A/B testing, user-centered design, and user testing, they're all really about making provisional moves and getting feedback as quickly as possible. To me, the fascinating thing about cybernetics is that it was all about control. It was about how do you control the aim of a gun? How do you control the temperature in your house? But what Wiener and others understood, and what really drove the development of the fundamental theories of information, Shannon's information theory and so on and so forth, was the idea that in order to have control, you needed communication. You needed information back. In a sense, you have to give up some of your control. Now, business, it's really about control, right? Always keep the stock price going up. Make sure that revenues are greater than expenses. keep the customers happy. But in the 21st century, in post-industrial society, in order to do that, businesses need feedback, and they need to have a feedback loop. Now, we can extend this idea of feedback, and we can continue with our military metaphor, and we can look at the work of John Boyd, who was a military strategist, and he studied the mental processes of fighter pilots in dogfights. And he developed what's known as the OODA loop, which was a model of the process that a fighter will go through of figuring out where their enemy is and what they should do and making a choice and doing it. And based on what you do as a fighter, your enemy will go through their own OODA loop. So you create this continuous competitive feedback loop. What Boyd figured out is that if you can make your OODA loop tighter than your enemies, in a sense that means if you can go through this decision-making process more quickly and more frequently than your enemy, you can gain the upper hand and you can win. So what does all of this mean for IT? Well, very simply, it means that we have to go through exactly the same transformations. And this notion of infusion just raises the stakes. So it used to be that, to be perfectly honest, IT was a little bit of a nice to have. If we have inventory reports every morning, we can run our business more efficiently, but the actual act of running our business isn't completely dependent on IT. And that's all changing. You know, we're at the point now where you can't make a phone call in your company without having a TCP network because it's running on voice over IP. Oftentimes, you can't serve your customers at all without IT. I've reached the point where 99% of my relationship with my bank is on their website. So without their website and without their IT department, from my perspective, the bank doesn't even exist anymore. You can't hear feedback and you can't optimize your OODA loop. You can't compete better. You can't be adaptable at all without IT. And in a sense, you could say that we've reached the point where really the purpose of IT is to create kind of this cybernetic substrate so that business can be adaptive and business can operate on feedback. So if we're going to think about, well, how do we do this? How do we engage in this adaptive cybernetic IT process? And if we express it in a similar vein to the Agile Manifesto in terms of values, what might we say? Well, we might say things like, we value adaptation over efficiency. Instead of trying to engineer systems that are very good at doing the same thing over and over again very efficiently, we need to engineer systems that are able to change based on input continuously. Agile really is the grandfather of this approach. And I want to say that from my perspective, Agile isn't about project management. It's not about burn-down charts. It's not about having better control and better visibility over who's doing what at any given point in time, or what the budget is on any given day or week. That Agile is really about cybernetics, in the sense that if you can release software every 2 weeks instead of every 2 months, you can get faster and more frequent feedback from your customers about whether your product does what they need it to, whether there are bugs that you need to fix. If you can demo your software for your product owner every 2 weeks instead of every 2 months, or not at all, you can get faster and more frequent feedback about whether what you built is what they really wanted you to build. We value feedback over planning. Rather than spending a lot of time trying to figure out exactly what it should be when we get to the end, we want to get as quickly as possible to the point where we're getting external information about how accurate whatever we're doing is. And we want to tighten that loop as much as possible and do it in as small batch sizes as possible. So when you look at things like continuous integration and continuous delivery, those are really about tightening that feedback loop. We value continuous learning over best practices. You know, in a complex systems and environment, you can't predict everything. You have to be flexible. And it may be that what works for you well today in a given situation won't work well in a different situation tomorrow. And you can't guarantee that you won't make that transition. So we need to not be too fixated on this is how we do things, but think in terms of, well, this is how we do things, but what else might we need to do that might be a little different? We value resilience over stability. Rather than trying to engineer systems that don't break, in a complex systems world, that doesn't happen. Systems break. What we want to do instead is try and engineer systems that can survive failure and maybe even flourish in it, so that it gets to the point where we don't care so much if things break because we know how to route around it. The corollary to that is we value minimizing mean time to repair over maximizing mean time between failure. The problem with focusing on engineering failure out is that when failure happens, we don't know what to do. What we want instead is to be able to fix things so easily and quickly that it's fine if things fail, because we can quickly fix them so quickly that maybe no one will notice. Interestingly, software development is actually really all about repairing things, because you always have a situation where there's some gap between what your product does and what your customer would like it to do, and you're always releasing new features which are really about repairing those failures. We value loose coupling over centralized coordination. The more we coordinate things, the more brittle they become. We value propagation over adoption. So when we discover these new ways of thinking about things and doing things, maybe instead of having a mandate that says, okay, now we're all switching from Java to .NET, you let that change flow and find out how well it really works and where it really works, and maybe you actually want to do a little Java and a little .NET, depending on the situation. And finally, and most importantly, we value customer outcomes over internal systems. In a service world, we need to holistically and coherently organize our company so that we can have a relationship with the customer. And it may be, from an efficiency point of view, we may like the idea of splitting dev and ops out into silos. But from the perspective of serving the customer, that may be problematic. We're at a key point in the history of IT where it's becoming critical to the very existence of business. And unfortunately, in a lot of ways right now, we're part of the problem instead of part of the solution. We've been branded the Department of No and the Department of Slow. And there's an increasing urgency, and we need to get beyond, at this point, arguing about Agile yes or no, or cloud yes or no, or how do we stop shadow IT from happening. The problem with that is that we no longer have control over the conversation, that businesses are leaving us behind. Development teams are going around IT and setting up their own infrastructure on Amazon. Business units are going around IT and setting up their own infrastructure on Dropbox or Box or what have you. So, in conclusion, what we need to do in the 21st century, what we need to do as we move from industrialism to post-industrialism, is transform ourselves from being resistant, we can't do it because blah, 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 or we won't let you do it because blah, blah, blah. We need to transform ourselves from being order takers. Okay, you want us to build this thing, we'll go and build this thing. We need to transform ourselves from taking a completely analytical, reductionist approach to things. And we need to transform ourselves into being proactive. CIOs are being told now that they have to drive innovation. So it's no longer a matter of just doing what you're asked, but we have to bring things to the business that helps the business accomplish its goals. We have to be creative about that and have something that's fresh and beneficial in a way that may not be obvious to everyone. We need to be adaptive and be prepared to, in Agile terms, embrace change and embrace feedback in all ways and all levels. And finally, we need to be user-centered. Simply put, that we need to focus on what is it that our customers want. And we are entering the realm where users within an enterprise are no longer just users, they are customers, they have a choice now, and we have to serve them like customers. And we have to serve our company's external customers in the same way, because we're no longer just hidden in the back scenes. Again, the bank is as much about IT systems as anything else, so IT has to serve and interact with the customer in that way. And so we have a lot of challenges, but we have some interesting things that we can do. And so I just want to put it out there as a challenge of let's go forward and let's do it. And thank you very much.